This channel focuses on developing an appreciation and understanding of visionary art. I'm Lisa, an Irish research student. In this video I discuss Apophenia, the pareidolic tendency and the potential image. If you've seen an image that resembles a face in the clouds or in the pattern of your wallpaper, you have experienced a form of apophenia. Apophenia is a general term to describe the natural human tendency to see patterns and meaning in otherwise meaningless data. This involves any kind of information, including visual, auditory, or a data set. The term was coined in 1958 by German neurologist Klaus Conrad, who was studying the unmotivated connections of seeing in patients with schizophrenia. This phenomenon is also referred to as patternicity or type 1 error. There are 4 subcategories of apophenia. 1. Gambler's fallacy. 2. Clustering illusion. 3. Confirmation bias. And 4. Pareidolia. Gambler's fallacy refers to people who regularly gamble and often fall prey to the gambler's delusion. They may perceive patterns or meaning in random numbers, often interpreting the pattern as an indication of an uncommon win. A clustering illusion occurs when a pattern is established by looking at large amounts of data, even when it is entirely random. Confirmation bias is a psychological phenomenon in which a person will test a hypothesis under the assumption that it's true. This form of apophenia can lead to overemphasizing data that confirms a hypothesis and explaining away information that disproves it. Lastly, pareidolia, this video's focus, is a type of apophenia that occurs specifically within visual stimuli. It is a term used to classify the psychological phenomenon of seeing familiar objects, patterns, animals, or the human form in otherwise random or unrelated shapes. So several sources connect the term pareidolia and art. However, it is limited. After some reading, it becomes clear that academics and philosophers have referred to the pareidolic tendency in different ways. For example, the phenomenologist Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of intermediary types that offer us a synthesis of external and psychic elements, like seeing a face in a flame or in the swirling patterns of a carpet. Or the art professor Dario Gamboni, who writes about the accidental and potential image. Or take, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci, who spoke of a newly invented type of seeing that inspires the mind to invent. He wrote, "By looking attentively at old and smeared walls, or stones and veined marble of various colours, you may fancy that you see in them several compositions, landscapes, battles, figures in quick motion, strange countenances, and dresses with an infinity of other objects. By these confused lines, the inventive genius is excited to new exertions." The propensity for assigning meaning to undefined forms is a regular human occurrence that can be traced far back into human history. It is also interesting to note the recurring claim that the first representations recorded by humanity were accidental images first suggested by natural sources. In the article, The Evolution of Human Artistic Creativity, Gillian Morris Kay suggests that the ancient origins of art lie within the African region, before humans dispersed worldwide. According to this scholar, there is evidence that early 2D drawings are clearly influenced by suggestive features on an uneven surface. In her view, the creation of images from imaginative perception required a seminal evolutionary change in the neural structures underpinning perception. This change would have had a survival advantage in both toolmaking and hunting. So a reference to pareidolia can be found later in the play The Birds by Aristophanes, written in the 4th century BC. Within this tale, the characters create an imaginary city by seeking and finding shapes in cloud formations. Likewise, a more recent example can be found in the Victorian feminist novella The Yellow Wallpaper, in which the protagonist, confined to her room, begins to imagine the wallpaper mutating. Eventually, she sees a figure in the design that she believes is a woman creeping on all fours behind the pattern. Also, let us not forget the signs and images assigned to the constellations, which the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard describes as the Rorschach test of infant humanity. So what is the connection between pareidolia and an artist's creative process? As established in the previous video, playful activity is considered to be an imaginative practice rooted in fantasy. However, in the psychiatrist Carl Jung's view, engaging with play in the imagination in the raw states possess no viable worth and instead need to be developed a stage further. This point is acknowledged by his differentiation between passive and active fantasy. The former refers to low-tension fantasies, which are the spontaneous and autonomous manifestations of unconscious complexes, whereas the latter refers to high tension fantasies, which are characteristic of the creative mentality evoked by intuition and directed towards the perception of unconscious content. Jung considered these high tension fantasies to be one of the highest forms of psychic activity. This observation is interesting. However, how does this idea of active and passive fantasy relate to apophenia? It is relevant here to consider the difference between Dario Gamboni's accidental and potential images. In Gamboni's view, both of these types give prominence to the imaginative side of perception. However, the accidental image is the initial manifestation of the pareidolic tendency. They are natural, miraculous, and automatic. In contrast, the potential image is formed after the accidental image and includes the artist and the audience's subjective interpretation. Gamboni explained, "Potential images are those established by the artist but dependent on the beholder for their realization, and their property is to make the beholder aware, either painfully or enjoyably, of the active and subjective nature of seeing." In this way, the artist challenges the very principle of representation and introduces the viewer to the power of the imaginative perception. An example of this transition from accidental to potential images, or passive and active fantasy, can be found in A New Method by the British artist Alexander Kozen. In this text, Kozen states that he has given up on copying the work of others and scenes from nature. Instead, he was to use an artificial blot on paper, which was swift, suggestive, instantaneous, accidental, and rude. The blot was then used as the first indication of a landscape, hastily produced in thick black ink, which the artist would later elaborate into a finished composition. His aim was to study the accidental image until proper meaning emerged, creating the potential image. Or, in other words, beginning with playful activity, the artist would passively produce compositions that would then be engaged with actively. Kozen's technique was not an isolated case and was used by many of his contemporary artists. For example, Francisco Goya, William Blake, and Caspar David Friedrich. Likewise, this technique has been used regularly throughout the history of art. For example, the decalcomania technique from the 18th century involved using ink, paint, or other mediums that were spread onto a surface and, while still wet, covered with materials such as paper or foil, which when removed transferred a pattern that was further embellished upon. Likewise, frottage was a technique developed by Max Ernst. It was a method of creative production that involved rubbing a pencil or other material against a texture, which was then again later embellished upon. These creative approaches all had something in common. They used the natural human tendency of pareidolia to encourage imaginative perception. By focusing on irrelevant and random forms, the artists were able to project their inwardly directed psychic processes to create unique and inspiring imagery. Thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, don't forget to leave a like or a comment. So bye for now.